When George Orwell conceived death worship in 1984, he was not inventing a fantastical ideology, but abstracting the logic he believed lay beneath every fully realized totalitarian state. Death worship, East Asia's doctrine centered on the obliteration of the self, describes a political order in which individual autonomy is systematically destroyed so that the state can become all-encompassing. Orwell insisted that the three superstates, Oceania, Eurasia, and Eastasia, were not meaningfully different. Their slogans varied, but their structures converged. In identifying death worship as a principle rather than a creed, Orwell offered a general model of how total power operates. By erasing identity, narrowing language, institutionalizing fear, and sealing off the possibility of independent judgment. The North Korean regime exhibits these dynamics not metaphorically or partially, but with startling precision. The Kim dynasty has constructed a political system that replicates the mechanisms Orwell associated with death worship: the dissolution of the private self into political ritual, the construction of a linguistic and symbolic world that replaces empirical reality, the fusion of emotional life with state-directed fear, and the suppression of information so complete that contrast becomes impossible. These features do not appear as isolated policies but as interdependent components of a total structure. Each reinforces the others, creating a system in which control deepens merely by continuing to operate. North Korea has manifested the same structural attributes that define Orwell's death worship. This does not imply that the regime was consciously modeled on Orwell's fiction, but that both the novel and the regime describe the same underlying architecture of domination. By examining how the triads of identity, language, emotion, and knowledge operate inside North Korea, it becomes clear that the state has achieved precisely the kind of totalizing configuration Orwell theorized: a self-reinforcing machinery of power in which life, meaning, and judgment are subordinated to the preservation of the political order itself. Every society must shape its members' sense of identity, create rules for behavior, and maintain a degree of social order. In a healthy system, identity forms through a mixture of family, memory, personal experience, and shared cultural reference. Obedience is negotiated through law, trust, or consensus. Order is sustained by people acting together out of interest, belief, or cooperation. But when a regime seeks to control rather than earn the loyalty of its population, these natural functions collapse into a rigid sequence. Identity is overwritten, obedience becomes compulsory, and order is performed rather than lived. In North Korea, the state inserts itself at the earliest stages of identity formation. Children are taught to think of the leader not just as a ruler, but as a parental figure and moral authority. Emotional attachment is redirected from the family toward the regime. As people grow, private thoughts become suspect. Self-disclosure is encouraged through ritual confession, and personal ties are subordinated to political loyalty. This erasure of the interior life does not occur all at once. It builds gradually, through 1,000 small displacements, until the self is occupied by the state. Once identity is hollowed out, obedience becomes less a matter of choice than of momentum. Individuals learn to monitor themselves before they are monitored by others. They predict what will be seen as disloyal, and adapt without needing to be told. The result is a kind of control that no longer depends on visible coercion. When this reaches a certain threshold, it begins to generate a surface of apparent stability. Mass celebrations, group mourning, ritualized slogans, these are not spontaneous expressions of unity, but the residue of internalized discipline. The population appears unified, because no one is in a position to act otherwise. The illusion of harmony conceals the absence of self. Language ordinarily helps people describe the world, communicate values, and deliberate over alternatives. It enables not only shared meaning but shared correction. When things are wrong, new language helps name and change them. But when the state seeks to control perception instead of respond to it, language ceases to serve reality. It begins instead to create a substitute for it. Terms are emptied of complexity and refilled with slogans. Once language is fixed in place, it traps not only communication but thought, and the structures of power it supports come to seem permanent. In North Korea, political language is not simply ideological, it is total. Phrases such as military first or eternal president are not metaphorical but compulsory. They dominate official speech, textbooks, murals, and songs. Their repetition is not for persuasion but for containment. Words that name struggle, betrayal, or loyalty are used not to explore experience, but to format it. Gradually, the available vocabulary shrinks. What remains is not a neutral tool but a filter. People do not only speak in the state's terms, they begin to perceive in them. Once this happens, the social order it describes becomes naturalized. The caste system that assigns each citizen a political classification, from core to hostile, comes to seem like a reflection of moral reality. Those who suffer do so because of impurity. Those who thrive do so because of loyalty. Without alternate words, no alternate frame exists. The system's own terminology defends the system from within. The distortion begins in the attempt to control perception, but it ends in a reality that cannot be seen from outside because the words to describe anything else no longer exist. Political systems rely on emotion to some degree, solidarity, belonging, pride, but these are unstable and often conditional. In normal societies, emotional bonds are formed through shared memory and mutual investment. But when a regime decides to manufacture emotional coherence through control rather than trust, it turns instead to fear. External threats are exaggerated or invented. Loyalty becomes inseparable from vigilance. The national identity that emerges is no longer aspirational, it is defensive, organized around imagined survival. In North Korea, political identity is produced through a constant interplay of love and danger. Citizens are taught to revere the leader with the intensity of religious devotion. At the same time, they are reminded, daily, visually, rhetorically, that they are surrounded by enemies. The United States, South Korea, Japan, defectors, internal saboteurs. These are not intermittent topics, they are central pillars of ideological education. Loyalty is defined not by shared ideals but by the urgency of standing together against destruction. The result is an identity structure that renews itself through fear. Citizens come to feel that obedience is not simply right, but necessary, that disloyalty is not just deviance, but treason against survival itself. In this context, submission feels like protection. The people are told they are the fortress, and the fortress is always under siege. When external circumstances change, diplomatic shifts, military tensions, economic shifts, the emotional structure remains intact by finding new threats to replace the old. The system does not need to invent fear each time, it only needs to keep the emotional machinery running. Identity, once it has been built on fear, does not require a stable enemy, it only requires a stable sense of danger. For political agency to be possible, people must be able to compare between truth and falsehood, between this world and another. In functioning societies, information flows through institutions, schools, media, libraries that help individuals develop not only facts, but standards of evaluation. But when a regime aims to dominate belief rather than persuade it, these institutions are not simply censored, they are emptied out. The goal becomes not just to block the wrong data, but to prevent the development of contrast altogether. Once comparison disappears, judgment dies quietly in its sleep. In North Korea, the control of information is, well, exhaustive. Western media is banned, foreign books are unavailable, and the internet exists only as a closed domestic system. But the real effect is not that people are ignorant, it is that their ignorance is structured. Schools teach only regime-approved material. History is rewritten to eliminate contradiction. Science is filtered through ideology. What remains is not merely a narrow worldview but a self-sealing one. Everything confirms the same logic because everything is selected to do so. Under these conditions, even if alternate information leaks in, it may not take root. Without a framework for contrast, a new image or idea may be noticed but not absorbed. People can see that something is different without understanding what it means. They may feel unease, curiosity, or confusion, but lack the categories to convert that experience into recognition. Only when enough new material accumulates, when contrast becomes undeniable, can judgment reawaken. But until then, the system remains intact, not because it persuades, but because it isolates. Its stability is maintained not by falsehood, but by the absence of anything to measure truth against. North Korea demonstrates with overwhelming clarity that Orwell's death worship is not a metaphor, a satire, or a theoretical limit, it is a system that can be built. Each of its core mechanisms functions not as a symbol, but as an institutional reality, the annihilation of personal identity, the replacement of language with command, the orchestration of fear into belonging, and the systematic dismantling of independent judgment. These elements do not merely exist in isolation, they lock together into a closed, recursive structure of control. The Kim regime has not approximated death worship, it has realized it. But the deeper significance of this argument lies not in its diagnosis of North Korea alone. It lies in the insight that any political system that prioritizes control over consent sets itself on the same structural path. The triads described here, identity overwritten, language weaponized, fear institutionalized, thought disarmed, are not exotic features of a singular regime. They're the logical outcomes of a specific governing impulse, the desire to make obedience automatic, to render dissent unthinkable, and to make the political order immune to contradiction. Totalitarianism, in Orwell's terms, is not about cruelty for its own sake. It's about the construction of a system that sustains itself by dissolving all that could oppose it, from within. That system begins not with mass violence, but with administrative refinement, schools that teach loyalty before curiosity, bureaucracies that reward silence over honesty, and media that preemptively define what is sayable. It grows as institutions tasked with representing the world begin instead to reshape it. And once that reshaping reaches identity, language, emotion, and knowledge, the state no longer needs to rule through visible terror. The population has already internalized the regime. This is the enduring relevance of Orwell's model. North Korea shows that death worship is more than a fictional construct. It is the logical outcome of any regime that treats power as an end in itself. The lesson is not confined to the extremes. It begins at the moment a government sees its citizens not as participants, but as subjects, not as sources of legitimacy, but as threats to be managed. From that point forward, the logic tightens, not because of evil intent, but because systems organized around control produce their own necessities. What Orwell called death worship is not only a warning about one country or one ideology, it is a theory of political entropy, the tendency of unchecked power to collapse the social world inward until only obedience remains. And in North Korea, that entropy has run to completion. The system does not merely rule the people, it replaces them.